Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Developing IEC 62304 Compliant Software, Proven Tips and Best Practices. My name is Cathy Wilburn. I am the Director of Quality Assurance and Compliance at the RND Group. At the RND Group, we specialize in medical device software. We provide services to help small startups to large industry players in the med device space. They hire us for our software development expertise. Today's webinar is hosted by Greenlight Guru, whose mission it is to improve the quality of life for their customers and their patients, likely a similar mission as many of you have joining me today. Greenlight Guru is constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether it's through hosting free webinars, partnering with world-class medical device experts, or through their award-winning QMS software. Greenlight Guru's modern QMS and EDC software solutions are built specifically for medical device companies to improve speed and efficiency while reducing risk. Over 1,000 of the world's leading MedTech companies trust Greenlight Guru. If you're ready, you can head over to www.greenlight.guru and they'll get you a personalized demo of the only solution that's built exclusively for medical devices. And now, on with our presentation. All right, so like I said, our topic today is developing IEC 62304 compliant software, proven tips, and best practices. IEC 62304 is an international standard. The current revision you can see there is an amendment. It actually was 2015, but 2016 is when it was adopted by the other organizations, ANSI and AMI. It originated with IEC. That's the originator of the standard. The title of it is called Medical Device Software Lifecycle Processes. It contains processes and requirements that cover software development all the way through software maintenance. It also gives you supporting processes like change management, configuration management, and problem report management and tracking. What's cool about 62304 is it's not prescriptive. It gives you the what, but not the how. So if you have existing software development processes in place, it's likely that you can incorporate a lot of the things that you already do, but just hook them to 62304 and make some modifications, to make them meet the requirements. The standard is applicable for software as a medical device and software in a medical device. The same requirements apply. It also is applicable to firmware. A lot of people ask, does it cover firmware? Because it doesn't explicitly state firmware, but yes, it's applicable to software and firmware both. Reasons why you want to adopt it is it promotes risk-driven development. And so it gives you different process activities and tasks that you complete based on the risk of your software item or your software system. And they have classes from A, B, and C. A being lower risk, C being higher risk. And the more risk that's involved with your piece of software, your software system, or if it's further divided into software items or units, the more rigor that you are to apply to ensure safety. In the standard, there's a flow chart that helps you figure out what classification to assign to your software. And you also will use the results of your software hazard analysis to further refine that answer. So by having different software classifications, A, B, and C, like I said, you can apply less rigor and, do less details to the Class A's than you do to the Class C's. So oftentimes for Class C, for software that we typically develop, will be our results processing algorithms. And so for those additional items that we have to do is we have to provide more detailed design and do more rigorous testing on that, which I think, for something as important as a results processing algorithm, you'd want to do that. In Class A, we might have some of our user management, some things like if you're just storing data, transferring data, some of those types of things would be considered Class A. Another reason that it's really good to use is that it employs good software engineering practices. So I went to school for software engineering, computer science, and took software engineering classes. And we learned these basics, the requirements, the design, the implementation, the testing, those are common, practices that have been around for a really long time and are known to produce better quality, higher quality software. So that's the thing that I like about it, is that it uses those things that we're all accustomed to. Another reason that you want to use it is because it's an FDA recognized consensus standard. So it's called out even in the guidance document, the content of pre-market submissions for device software functions, as you are able to use it for part of your submission. And so you may submit a declaration of conformity to specific clauses, and the guidance document has the specific clauses that you need to provide that declaration for. And they're related to the software development, configuration management, and the maintenance practices. So using 62304 gets your software where it needs to be for submission. It's also a harmonized standard in the EU. Now, the EU has harmonized the 2006 version, but I've heard that notified bodies are advising medical device manufacturers to go ahead and use the current version of the standard. And by using it, it aids you with what you need to submit in your technical file. And also, a while back, we had a client who was going through to get a CE mark, and they were working with BSI, and BSI wanted a checklist to show that they were compliant to 62304. So that's the what and the why, but really what we're going to talk about today is the how. How are you going to get this implemented in your organization? And here I have some basic steps, and we'll go into detail for each of these. But you want to perform a gap analysis. You want to make sure that you align with the FDA and the EU or any other regulatory body that you plan on submitting to. You want to establish comprehensive documentation. Consider iterative evolutionary software development lifecycle models and practices, and then also promote awareness and training within your organization. So the first thing we're going to talk about is performing a gap analysis. You want to make sure that you start early. Go ahead and start now. So I hear a lot, people say, when do we have to start this? They want to just get to the coding and get something that's tangible that they can run, that they can see. So while you can still, you can do your feasibility and, get something up and running and test your concepts, you want to get started as early as you can, because the sooner you get started, the better off you're going to be in the long run. It's much easier to document and perform the necessary activities of 62304 as you go through the development process, rather than trying to wait till the end. And you may end up having to redo some things because you didn't document them correctly. So it's always best to get started right now. And a way to get started, you want to make sure you read and understand the actual standard itself. And if you don't have the time, or the capability to do that, then hire help, hire consultants to help you do this work. You want to make sure that you know your current state. So by doing this gap analysis, you're going to create a checklist. You're going to identify the clauses, which basically become the requirements of 62304. And you're going to fill in, I use an Excel spreadsheet, and fill in where you're meeting these, or, and if you're not, note that you're not, but you want to figure out where you are so you can see the gaps and know where you need to be. What I do is like I said, I have a checklist, and clauses and requirements are, at the beginning of it. And then I identify where we have things covered in procedures, templates, and perhaps project documentation. Here's an example of what that spreadsheet might look like. I just cut out a little piece of 62304, the 5.11 section there. So you see in the first few columns, I have procedures. So I want to identify where in my procedures I've said that we're going to do this, meet this requirement, where we say, okay, this is where you do it and how you do it. And then if applicable, I'll identify a template. So the software development planning, the result of that activity is a software development plan. So the items that are required for you to perform, I'm going to have evidence of those in my software development plan template. And then also I have a project evidence. So if I follow that procedure and I use that template, if template is applicable, I'll give you an example here in just a minute of where you may not have a template, but where will I find that project evidence? So here it is filled in. And you can see that I have the procedure name. We have a high-level procedure called software development procedure with a section of procedure that defines the majority of what we do. And then we have a template related to that for the software development plan. So that is a deliverable. That's a design history file document. And then the project evidence. So if I follow this procedure, use this template, my project will have a project-specific software development plan. And then you can see the last row, this is related to traceability. So we have a template for a software trace matrix, and then our evidence is the software trace matrix that's project specific. Here's another example. This is talking about the unit verification process. Part of what we do for unit verification is that we do code reviews. We have a specific procedure, and you can see we have it called out in our software development procedure to use that procedure. It's in the section software design and technical reviews. And then we have specific meeting minutes that are geared towards code reviews. We have different ones based on what type of work product that we are reviewing. So we might have a requirements one, a design, implementation, and so on. And so that's what that template is calling out there. But we're using Bitbucket on some of our projects, and we are allowing code reviews through Bitbucket. And so we're keeping track and providing that evidence in a pull request. And so that's why in the project evidence, I have in there that it's going to be either meeting minutes or pull request, or it could be some combination of the two. But regardless of whichever method you use, you have it defined in your software development plan. And just as a reminder, if you're using a tool to track or maintain a record of evidence of following your process, it needs to be validated. So of course, in our case, we have Bitbucket validated. So often I get asked, well, I don't have a process. We just got started. We're developing some software, but we don't have a process. I argue that you do have a process. You just may not know what it is, and it isn't documented. So your software developers are doing something. And oftentimes, especially in a med device environment, even if it's in concept and feasibility, they are checking code in and out. They're using tools. They're tracking issues. They're really doing some of the things that already need to be done. It's just not shared among the organization, and it's not documented. So what we do in those cases is we interview. We interview software teams to understand what their process is, what their practices are, what they're doing to develop the software. And then I use that same spreadsheet to document what they said. And it's important to track which team said what, because you might want to learn more. So, you go through and you go, oh, well, you're actually doing something that we need to be doing. So make sure you track who's doing it so that you can go back to them later and learn more about what they're doing and perhaps even put it into your software development process. After you get your gap analysis, then you'll start on remediation. So you're going to tackle all of the gaps, and you're going to, create processes, document your process for those gaps. I recommend starting out with kind of a high-level process and starting at the beginning of the software development process. So if you think about the different documents, that you have to produce and the different activities that you have to perform, you're going to start with software planning. So that's the area that I would get spelled out the most. And if applicable, I would create a template for that as well. And then you'll add more details. You'll kind of be working side by side with your software team, doing, the deliverables and defining the process as they need it. And you're going to add more details. You'll add templates as needed. So initially, if you have just one project, it may not make sense to develop a template and then have your project team implement that template. So a lot of times what I suggest there is we create the document and they go ahead and fill it in and, make it project specific. And then as your organization grows and as you get more projects, then you make a template from that document. You pull the project specific things out of it, you make it a little bit more generic. So then it can be applied to all of your other projects that you have. And it's important as you go through, as you finish, each project, make sure that you're going back and reviewing your process and having those retrospectives and finding out how things worked. You know, does the team feel good about what they're doing? Do they feel like they're producing quality software? You know, is there value in all of the things that you're, you know, that are in your process? And then make updates based on that. The next thing is to align with the FDA and the EU and any other regulatory body that you're working with. Those are the top two that we work with. So that's mostly what I have here. So when you're writing your process document, 62304 is an international standard. It's not related to the FDA or the EU. It can be applied, you know, to both. However, there's different terminology that's used. And so I feel it's really important in your process document to call out those differences so that when you have different readers from different backgrounds of your documentation, it's not hard for them to connect the dots of what you mean. And so an example is 62304 uses software detailed design, an SDD. The FDA, in their submission documentation, they want a software design specification. Those two are very similar documents. They could even be one for one. In our case, they are a match. And so we make sure we call that out that, hey, this SDD is equivalent to an SCS. And you can do that in your text, but oftentimes it'll be in your glossary or terminology sections of your process, just like I said, to connect those dots. Another one is SOUP and OTS and COTS. So SOUP is used in 62304. OTS we hear about from the FDA a lot. And while those aren't a one-for-one, you may have SOUP that's not OTS, and you could have OTS that's not SOUP. So it's really important if you are, you know, you want to explain the differences between the two and make sure that when per 62304, you are saying for SOUP, I need to highlight, you know, these aspects of SOUP. For example, functional requirements, any hardware, software, dependencies, things like that. Make sure that you also include what needs to be there for OTS. A final example is terminology related to what we would term, you know, our software modules, components. That's kind of the language I think software developers are used to using more often, but 62304 uses software unit, item, and system. However, it leaves it up to the medical device manufacturer to define what that means. And so you may choose to adopt unit, item, and system and explain what that means, or you may choose to go with components and modules, but explain the correlation and connection to unit, item, and system. And same with software function. That's, you know, the new guidance document for related to software, device software functions. So you want to make sure that you, like I said, you connect those dots between all of that terminology so that it's clear. In addition to matching up terminology, there's also some terminology or process elements that aren't included in 62304 that you need to make sure you account for. FDA uses design controls. We're all familiar with design controls. I think we've heard it so much, right? But then we get to 62304 and we're like, where's the design controls? They're not talking about design input, output, design verification, design validation. So again, we have to connect the dots where it's applicable. For example, design verification is equal to system verification in 62304. And of course, you have design inputs and outputs defined in 62304, but they're not called such. And so you need to make sure that you're connecting those and then you're accounting for the items that are not in 62304. Other things, missing terminology, design history file, risk management file, cybersecurity. There's nothing in 62304 about cybersecurity. So we need to make sure that that's included in our process because it's, you know, extremely important. So my main point with this is you can use 62304 as your, you know, kind of your starting point, but make sure you're aware of everything outside of 62304 that needs to happen within your software and make sure that you account for it in your process. Okay, the next item is to develop comprehensive documentation. Comprehensive documentation, it kind of goes back to what I said before, right? We're not just doing 62304, but we need to be comprehensive in thinking about the regulatory bodies and, terms and processes that are required there too. But what I'm talking about here is specifically related to 62304. So you want to make sure that you cover all requirements. You can match text word for word, but remember 62304 gives you the what, not the how. So even if you do match the text word for word, you have to add more to that text to explain how you're going to do that. You want to make sure that in your process sentences that you indicate the evidence. So you're going to say that you have to do something by doing it this way, and you're going to produce this evidence so that it's clear, how you have that proof that you performed that activity. Another thing that's really important is to explain how the activities of 62304 fit into your software development lifecycle model. So the standard itself doesn't dictate a model. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but there is no specific model that it says you have to follow for your software development. So if you're using a specific lifecycle model, you want to make sure that your workflow of your document is related to that model, but yet those activities of 62304 are worked into the phases, of that lifecycle model. Another key element is to describe how you align with product development. So software in a medical device, we're just one piece of the big picture, right? So it's important, and it's actually required in 62304 to describe how you have that alignment. We will often use a chart that shows two timelines, and they have the different phases, the phases of product development and the phases of software, and they show how they line up. This is especially important when you get to your product design validation, because your design validation is the whole entire system. So that needs to include software. So we need to make sure that we've completed our software verification before the product gets to design validation, so that that can be included. And another really important reason for this is your design reviews. Some people use gates, but regardless, you have design reviews that happen periodically through your product development process. 62304 doesn't call out any specific design reviews that need to be held. So oftentimes those software documents are scooped up into the product development design reviews and become part of the certain gates that they have. So it's just really important that you coordinate the activities. Here's an example. This is from 62304. It's part of the requirements analysis section. And it says the manufacturer shall verify and document that the software requirements ... and has items that the software requirements have to meet. And so to implement this into a process, I would say something like the software team shall verify and document that the software requirements, and then start with the first one, implement system requirements, including those related to risk control, by, and then explain how you're going to do that. And so what we do is we provide tracing from the system requirements to the software requirements. And I would explain that, and then also state using such and such template or, document. And if I didn't have a template, then I would just name what the document, the output document will be. And then the other items do not contradict one another, are expressed in terms, et cetera, et cetera. What we typically do there is we do that through a review process, a technical review. So I would explain that we're going to verify all of these things by holding a technical review, which would produce meeting minutes, if applicable. If you're using that approach, you can use other approaches, but that's just an example. So anyway, that gives you an idea of using the text, but making sure that you add on to the text to provide that how to the what. More tips for producing comprehensive documentation. So we talked about process. Now we're talking about project specific. So like I said, the project documents that you produce, they're evidence of performing activities. It's not just filling in templates or, completing a document or something. It's because you need to provide evidence that you did an activity. Even your requirements, you think about writing requirements document, but the the writing of the requirements is to show that you did requirements analysis. And in 62304, there's many different requirement types that need to be considered. So you're showing through that requirements document that you did that analysis, you considered those different types of requirements. And you want to make sure you don't wait till the end. You'll get better documentation if you do it along the way and make updates as you go, and make sure that the final one there, keep documents up to date. I know documentation is nobody's thing to do. I always think of Monsters Inc. Do you guys remember Roz in Monsters Inc. when she gets mad at Mike Wazowski because he has to finish his paperwork? So every time I think about design documentation, if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, go on YouTube, see if you can find that clip, because it's really funny. And now every time you complete a document, you're going to think of Roz, just like I do. Another way to make sure that you have comprehensive documentation is to develop and use templates. We use templates for almost everything, and it gives us a head start on our project documentation. So it's like, kind of the concept of not reinventing the wheel. There's some text that is likely to be the same or very, very similar across all your projects, especially some of your intro and your scope and, description of the process. Those kinds of sections are the same. And so we'll add text and to those templates that our project leads and tech leads and verification leads can jump right in and start using that template and have a head start. It's always easier to start with something than it is to start from scratch, always. And so it just gives them that starting point. And we often will put instructions in the templates as well, so that they understand what needs to go in that section. And then we'll indicate if things are optional or required. Sometimes we have sections that if they're optional, and maybe they're optional for this type of product, but required for this type, or could be that they're optional depending on, what classification is or how it's going to be regulated. And so we'll indicate that and indicate the criteria. So this next section is, I want to make sure that people are considering iterative, evolutionary software development lifecycle models and practices. Like I said, 62304 does not prescribe a software development lifecycle model. Now, if you look at it, you open up the standard and you look at those sections and you see, 5.1 is software planning, 5.2 is software requirements, 5.3 is software design. You look at it and go, oh, that's waterfall. And waterfall has just gotten a really bad rap now, right? Back in the beginning, waterfall was the only model we had back when I was in school. Everything was waterfall, right? And so, but that's not the case anymore. And actually 62304 is not waterfall. It looks like it just because of the organization of the document. That's it. You actually can apply any kind of software development lifecycle model that you want, as long as you perform the activities that are defined in 62304. You can use Scrum, you can use iterative, evolutionary, incremental, some combination of those. Any of those, whatever you define, you can use. You can use time boxed iterations, or you might have variable sized iterations. We at the R&D Group, we have different project leads who run their projects differently. And some use more of a Scrum with a time boxed iterations. Others use variable sized iterations. And those iterations are dependent on the time it takes to implement a specific feature set. So you have lots of options. You just have to define it and link the two together. This is from AMI's TIR 43. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. But this is just an example of an iterative software development lifecycle model. So always you kind of have this, concept, some preliminary requirements, preliminary design, and then you're going to start doing these iterations. And in this model, you may or may not deliver. It says and delivery, but you may or may not deliver. And you may deliver at stage 2, but not stage 1, or or whatever. But the idea is that you are going through these iterations and you are implementing new features, doing bug fixes in these iterations. This one here is an example of evolutionary. And again, you have your beginning things, your preliminary requirements, your preliminary design, and you go into, again, you can use iterations for this, but you have a version, and then you may deliver that version to get feedback. If you're working with work like we do, we have a client that's the medical device manufacturer of record. And so we're delivering those incremental evolutionary releases to them to get feedback. We do that through demos. They may not get a hold of the entire release. We may just be demoing something for them. And then we get feedback. And then we do some more work, and, you know, we keep going through that and growing the product until finally it's ready to deliver that final version. By using models like this, you have frequent iterations and feedback loops. So you get early detection and resolution of issues. Now, these issues could be related to product, process, people. You know, by doing frequent iterations that require, you know, something to be demoed or people to see your progress, you can get quick feedback on your resources and how they're performing. And, you know, and if they're not performing well, you know, you can get them help. And also on your documentation. And I think that most people would agree that the earlier there's studies, right, out there that prove it, but the earlier you can detect an issue, the easier it is to fix, or, you know, or the less costly it is to fix. I think about issues in a workflow, especially. So maybe you're doing, you know, some kind of testing, an in vitro diagnostic, and you have a workflow on the instrument, the user interface for that. And, you know, we're doing A, B, and C, and somewhere along the line, we didn't understand requirements, and we did A, B, we skipped C and went straight to D. Well, if we show that to our client, then they see that, and we're able to fix that right away. That's just an example. It also promotes collaboration, and it's really good for, especially between, you know, inside your own team with software developers and verification. Those verifications engineers can get a good look early on at what a feature is going to look like, rather than waiting until maybe it's fully implemented or waiting until the end. So, and I already talked about getting feedback from your users and your clients too. And it produces better documentation. So we start out with some documentation and the basics are covered, but then we refine and we add more details as we know it. The best way to get started using, if you want to use, you know, a full-blown software development lifecycle like Agile, that is Agile, then you want to use AMI's TIR 45. They just updated it in March of this year. The name of it is called the Guidance on the Use of Agile Practices in the Development of Medical Device Software. And this diagram is so very important, because what it shows you is that for each of the elements in the Agile process that you're producing, so you have a product, and then that product is made up of releases. And then within that release, you may have iterations or increments, and then those increments are made up of your backlog items, or if you could use stories, but we tend to just stick to backlog items. But what this diagram shows you is it shows you at each type of extraction, what activities need to be performed. So initially, you're going to do some planning. You're going to do high-level requirements. You're going to do some architecture. Then when you start getting into what releases you're going to produce, you're going to do a little bit more planning, because you're going to plan those individual releases. We may want, you know, the first release is to go for user studies or something, right? And then maybe the next one is for clinical trials. Maybe the next release is market. And oftentimes there'll be some different features or nuances in those releases. So you can add that planning to your software development plan through the software development planning activities. And then for each increment or each iteration, you're gonna do some additional planning, and you're going to do some refinement of your requirements for each of your backlog items. So each of your items you're going to look at, you're going to add more details to your requirements. You're going to add more details to your design. You're going to start working on testing, how you're going to test that individual item versus also how you're going to test it within the context of the whole entire system. So like I said, this is a really good guidance document to really help you define your process using Agile. Some other tips when you're implementing Agile practices or, some of the concepts is to make sure you don't forget testing and verification of individual stories. Now, you did see it on the last slide, but I've worked in organizations, not the RND Group, but I've worked in other organizations where they have their backlog items and they're calling them done when they're implemented. And so you have to be really careful because you're not really done until it's been tested and verified. And so you want to make sure that when you define done, you include those other activities, or you could even, depending on how you want to do your sprint items and calculate your burn downs and all of that, you could create additional items for the testing of those items. It doesn't really matter. Whatever works best within your organization. But you want to make sure that you define what done means. I know that's a term that's used a lot. Make sure that you include documentation in your story acceptance criteria. So it's not, again, kind of goes with done. It's not done until you've updated the requirements or you've updated the design, or at least you've confirmed that they're accurate. And also feel free to modify your tools to fit your implementation. You don't have to use tools right out of the box. A lot of them for Scrum and Kanban, they may have a to-do, an in progress, and a done. That's what I've seen most commonly. Very, very simple, right? But I think for med devices, it has to go a little bit further. And at the R&D Group, we have a to-do, an in progress, and then we have a reviewed state or a column, swim lane. And that means that it's been reviewed by the developers. It's gone through its code review, peer review, whatever. And then it's not done until the individual item has been verified. And so, like I said, just feel free to modify your tools to fit your implementation. More tips, make sure you plan for formal software verification / system testing. So again, not at R&D, but another place that I worked at, they would go through a sprint and developers would get done. Maybe there would even be a little bit testing, but then, we weren't ready to release because we hadn't done that system testing. So you have to make sure that you plan for that within your sprints. And you may choose to stagger your sprints. So maybe developers finish and maybe you do initial testing of, each item by the end of one sprint, but then the next sprint is all focused on your software verification and your system testing effort. Just want to make sure you plan for it. Don't forget about it. You also want to gate the start of your formal verification. And by that, I mean that after you finish your implementation, you've code reviewed, you verified your individual items, you want to make sure that all your documentation not only is updated, but it's also been approved. And kind of, have that gate before you start that sprint or whatever you do for a formal verification. Another item, we've already talked about it, but I wanted to bring it up again, is to make sure you're delivering or you're demoing those individual iteration releases to your clients and stakeholders, or at a minimum internally to other people who are on the team that may not be working on that specific piece, especially like your verification engineers. You also want to make sure that you turn your user stories into requirements. So because we're doing medical devices, we need actual requirements like the software shall do this, software shall do that, right? We need those. So take those user story narratives and turn those into requirements that can be incorporated into your requirements documents. And then the final tip is to make sure you allow fluidity with your other activities. I mentioned testing a lot, but make sure you have fluidity with your requirements, your design, and your test. And by that, I mean that I like to see some high-level requirements developed first, and then adding more details with each sprint and iteration to allow for correct implementation. You would document an initial design. Definitely your architecture needs to be documented, really before you start your implementation. But even your detailed design, some basic ideas of what you're going to do, how you're going to implement, how you're going to meet these requirements, and then add more details as they're implemented. At the R&D Group, what we do is it's not in 62304, but it's something that was born out of process improvement, a way to improve, what we do internally. We have a feature design document, and the developer creates a document and basically walks through the design. What requirements are they implementing? How are they going to implement them? What kind of unit tests are they going to do? What kind of verification is needed for it? Is there any cybersecurity related to this feature? And then that's reviewed with the team. Similarly, to like a code review or something like that's reviewed with the team and kind of given a stamp of approval, like, yes, you're on the right track, go ahead and go implement. And that document isn't a living document. We don't keep it up to date. It's just kind of a one-time document. But then later we create the more detailed detailed design document based on the items that are in there. And so that goes in line with the concept of doing an initial design with kind of, the basics, and then adding more details as you go. We do something similar for our test cases as well. We will create test case designs that are reviewed. And in the test case designs, we talk about different scenarios that we plan to test. And this saves time, because this is kind of an agreement that, yes, the verification engineer understands the feature and understands it well enough, and thought about the right scenarios, or maybe missed some, and so they're added before time is spent on developing out those test cases and putting in the specific details of how to execute. So those are some tips that we've implemented in our organization. The final tip is to promote awareness and training. So want to make sure that, I feel like in med devices in general, not just 62304, but make sure that your software organization really understands why they're having to do the process that they're doing. If they worked anywhere else, they're likely not doing as much documentation, and even may have more flexibility in the content of the documentation. We know through 62304 and also what the FDA requires, there's specific information we need to have in our documentation. So I think it's really important to share that with your software team. Let them know the why behind the process, and then also communicate the benefits of the chosen process. So especially if you're an established company like we are, we've been doing software for med devices for over 25 years now, and our process has grown and evolved. And so there are some things that we're doing that other organizations may not do, but we're doing them because we know the benefits. And so I think it's important to share that. Also, make sure that you give time to activities like lessons learned, retrospectives, and other process improvement activities. Make sure that you're working with your teams and you're talking about what worked, what didn't work, and so on, so that you can be constantly improving your process. All right, so final couple slides are just a recap of what we've talked about today. So want to make sure you start now, don't wait, get started, get that process defined, make sure it's compliant with what it needs to be, and get busy on it. Make sure through that gap analysis, you're identifying your current state. And like I said, you want to make sure that it's not just 62304, but it's any other requirements that you need to comply with. Make sure you're documenting your process, perform that gap analysis. Align with your FDA, EU, any other regulatory bodies that you need to. Make sure that you add process that's not covered in 62304, as well as align terminology. Connect those dots for your consumers of your documentation. Also, establish comprehensive documentation. Make sure you explain the how. The standard covers the what, but you need to provide the how. Use templates so that you can produce comprehensive project documentation. Take a look at some iterative, evolutionary, agile related models. Like I said, you don't have to use the model kind of textbook out of the textbook, straight out of as it's defined. You can create your own software development lifecycle model, what works best for you, and incorporate some of the best of the best of all of those into your own. But especially important, I think, are iterations, and if you want to use sprints, but some type of iteration. Make sure you're doing demos, deliveries, clearly define how your software development lifecycle model, what activities have to be happening in each of the phases as related to the 62304 activities. Start high level, but don't forget the details. Make sure you go back and get those details. And then finally, promote awareness and training.